I want to welcome you to the latest episode of my series, The Strange and Unexplained Phenomena of the South Mountains of North Carolina. This is episode 6, part 1. The title of this episode is Sudden Terror. Now, I love hearing and collecting the first-hand accounts of people who have witnessed things, especially the people who have witnessed the phenomena that are known to occur here in the South Mountains area. There's a couple of subcategories that intrigue me even more. One of those is hearing the accounts of the old timers, and there's a couple of reasons for that, but one of them is it helps date this phenomena. The common myth is that all of this began in December of 1978, in the early part of 1979. That's when all this started, and that simply is not true. And talking with the old timers who tell me of their accounts when they were younger, telling me accounts of their parents, their grandparents, it helps date this, and it goes back decades and decades and decades. And I'll be doing an episode on the history of the progression of this cryptid phenomenon here in the South Mountains at a later date. But today I bring you the story of one of the old timers, a dear friend of mine who has since passed on, and I'm just going to refer to him in this episode as Smitty, but I dedicate this to Smitty. May you rest in peace, brother. Smitty was a hardcore country boy, outdoorsman, fisherman, hunter, camper, hiker. He knew these South Mountains like the back of his hand. The only time that he didn't live here in this area is when the United States Army drafted him and sent him to Vietnam. The year was 1971. He had just finished his 2-year stint in the United States Army. And he was home back in his beloved South Mountains and was just readjusting. And he had an uncle with whom he was particularly close. And his uncle, again, rekindled their relationship. And on a certain day, he suggested going squirrel hunting. But he suggested that they visit an area that was particularly rich in squirrels. And the day that I interviewed Smitty about this, he said, I didn't want to go. And I asked him why. And he said, because that area is further back inside the South Mountains. And he said, we were always uncomfortable there. We felt like we were being watched. Many times we heard strange noises, especially when it was close to sundown. But on this occasion, he said he agreed. The idea of an area plentiful in squirrel. And you got to remember, to this day, there's people here in this area that are poverty-stricken, but even more so back in this area's history, back in the 1970s. And the idea of putting some food on the table wasn't just a sport, it was a necessity. So they went, he and his uncle. And this particular area, as I said, was deeper into the South Mountains on the Cleveland County, North Carolina side of the South Mountains. So it required a hike. And they began their journey about 10 that morning, wanting to get there and do early afternoon and early evening hunting. And they began their journey that day. And it required them to ascend one of the small mountains on the south side of the South Mountains. And then from there, they would have to descend back into a creek bottom, go partially upward up the next mountain to this area that was rich in squirrel, rich in hickory trees, rich in oak trees with the acorns and the hickory nuts, particularly concentrated in those trees. As they reached the peak of the first mountain that they needed to cross, they stopped for a rest. And Smitty, fresh home from the jungles of Vietnam, was still in a state of hyper observance. And he said as he looked around, he looked downhill, and approximately 300 yards away, there was a large, hair-covered creature kind of laying on a large log. And Smitty told me, he said, I actually thought I was seeing things. He said he questioned what he was seeing, so he pointed out to his uncle, who verified that that's what they were seeing. And I asked him to describe it. He said it was very, very large, completely covered in hair with a pointed head. And that the whole back of its head was covered in hair, and you couldn't even see ears. They never saw the front at that time. and they watched it, just kind of in shock. And as though this creature knew that it was being watched, it suddenly got up and didn't turn all the way around, but turned slightly and then proceeded north in the opposite direction, downhill, which was the direction they were headed. They discussed the matter. They knew of the phenomena in this area, the old phenomena, but they decided to continue anyway. Part out of curiosity, and of course part out of wanting to get a good hunt that day. And so they proceeded. And they began to ascend from that peak they had previously occupied. And they got down to that next creek bottom, and they ascended up the next mountain partially to the area in question. And they began their squirrel hunt. But to their surprise that day, they saw not one squirrel. Very unusual. Extremely unusual. Never before, said Smitty, had they not left there with less than a dozen squirrel. But that day they saw nary a squirrel. And as it came close to time to pack it in and leave, they heard what Smitty described as a deep holler, like something, quote, was mad at them. He said it was very close, but they could not see it, and they froze in place and watched. And as they watched, they soon began hearing footsteps, and the footsteps were getting closer to them. The problem was that the footsteps was coming from the direction they needed to go. And they didn't know what to do. They didn't want to go the opposite direction because that led further into the interior of the South Mountains. Then suddenly they saw it. The sun wasn't set yet, but it was getting close. They saw what Smitty described as a giant hairy booger. Now, booger is a southern term for a monster. And I asked him to describe it. He said it went 500-600 pounds easy, 7 feet tall or taller, covered in hair except for its eye area, its nose area, and its mouth area. And that it was a dark reddish brown hair. It came closer and then it stopped. The men were completely shocked and terrorized, and for good reason. They were only armed with 16-gauge shotguns, and those shotguns they had birdshot. Not a very effective thing to defend yourself with. And they were just unsure what to do. But it began to move closer. And it would stop and do another one of those yells, a howling growl. And that on several occasions, they saw it show its teeth. It would stop and put on this display of aggression. And so they decided to head the opposite direction of the way they actually needed to go, and to go up that hill to the top of that mountain. And it pursued them the whole way. They would stop to get a breather. At one point, the uncle fell, and Smitty had to help him up, but they got to the peak, and it was still coming. They descended back down that peak, heading toward a creek bottom that Smitty knew would take them to a road. And as they got halfway down that other side of that small mountain, they heard that yelling, growling howl once again, and they looked up, and this creature that they reported was standing there putting on the biggest aggressive display yet, repeatedly yelling in the manner it had been yelling and showing its teeth, and it was rocking back and forth and back and forth, and then would start yelling again. And they kept going. They reached the creek bottom. By then it was dark. Out there in these woods at night, and it dark, it's not a fun place to be. They reached the creek bottom. They made the road. They got out of there. And my friend Smitty said, Jerry, I never went back to that area again. And he said, I never went hunting again without also being armed with a .44 Magnum pistol. And the man was terrified when he told me the story. I appreciate all of you. See you next time.